Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I'm the director of the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment, where I am at Gonzaga here in Spokane, Washington. It's my pleasure to be with you today, even if only electronically, for the latest installment of our ongoing lecture series. We have a really excellent talk today, but before we get into that, I'd like to first, remind you that these events, as valuable as they are, also take resources. And so if you have any additional sources of support that you could provide, we would always be very grateful to have your support so that we can continue to host these events and also do really important and impactful climate work in the inland Northwest. And then secondly, I'm really excited to bring to your attention the lecture series events that we're going to be hosting this fall. So as you can see on your screen, we've got a really great series of events that will be launching starting on September 4th. My colleague, Dr. Bi Zhao from our political science department here at Gonzaga will be sharing some of her latest research. As you can see here, Who Tells Your Story? Framing of Climate Change by Women and Indigenous Peoples at the United Nations. And then on September 16th, we're going to be hosting our keynote event of the year, just a little bit before the November elections. We'll be hosting the wonderful Dr. David Orr, emeritus from Oberlin College, who will be talking about democracy in a hotter time. And I can't think of a more timely and important topic than that. As many of you know, on the first Wednesday of each October, we host the Spokane Candidates Climate Change Forum, where Gonzaga students ask candidates for local office what they would do to address the climate crisis if elected. And so I encourage you to tune in on that on Wednesday, October 2nd. That's the 6th annual Spokane Candidates Climate Change Forum. In October, on 22nd, a panel of colleagues based around a book that was recently of the same title, Rewilding the Urban Frontier, River Conservation in the Anthropocene. So different authors from that anthology will be on a panel and sharing their research. Really interesting set of topics. And then finally, on December 3rd, we're going to have Nadita Baja from talking about confronting the population denial amid unraveling global crises, is a topic that a number of you have asked us to consider covering, the population aspect of the ecological challenges that we're facing. And so we're excited to host her on December 3rd. These are all of the events on your screen will actually be in person, with the exception of the December 3rd event, which will be Zoom only, but all of them will be live streamed and put on our YouTube channel along with this event tonight. So you can catch it later or share it with others if you would like. And so I encourage you to go to gonzaga.edu/climate events and register for each of these events that interests you. And we'd love to have you for any of those events. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. This is a colleague, Eileen Crist, who is a wonderful scholar whose work I really admire so greatly. I've been following and using for years in my own research. Dr. Crist taught in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech for 22 years until she retired in 2020. Her work focuses on the biodiversity crisis and destruction of wild places, pathways to halt these trends, and ways forward toward creating an ecological civilization. She is co-editor of numerous books, including Keeping the Wild and Protecting the Wild. She has authored and co-authored numerous academic papers as well as popular writings, associate editor of the online journal The Ecological Citizen, which is a free online journal that I encourage you to look at, The Ecological Citizen. Her most recent book, Abundant Earth, Toward an Ecological Civilization, is fantastic. Highly recommend Abundant Earth, Toward an Ecological Civilization, from University of Chicago Press in 2019. For all of that, you can find her easily online at eileencrist.com. Please join me in a very dissatisfying but nevertheless hearty welcome of Dr. Crist onto our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
It's our pleasure. I'll hand it off, and if I see any problems, I'll hop back on, but otherwise assume all is well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I've been studying and teaching about climate change since the late 1990s when I was hired at Virginia Tech. In my courses, I always taught a module on climate change. Among my slides, I included two about consequences. The first I called expected consequences, like droughts, floods, heat waves, and wildfires. The second I titled worst case scenarios, which in those days sounded almost like science fiction. Release of Earth's stored methane, dieback of phytoplankton in the Amazon, and slowing down of the Gulf Stream, sea level rise redrawing the world's geography. Today, the worst case scenarios are either underway or have been bumped up to the category of expected consequences. Throughout the 2000s and most of the 2010s, undergraduates confronted the material with skepticism. But by the time I retired in 2020, I had witnessed a sea change. From students challenging me that climate shifts reflect natural cycles or that climate change is a hoax, to climate change upgraded to consensual reality. In my last year at Tech, I regularly had climate activist students in the classroom. It was eye-opening to live through that historic shift in the reception of climate change in the microcosm of the classroom. I also taught a module on the biodiversity crisis, destruction of ecosystems, defaunation, marine life collapse, the sixth extinction. I always taught climate change and the biodiversity crisis back to back since they are closely connected. Both are global scale, both signal the end of nature as an independent force, both herald irreversible and dangerous state shifts. The two are also empirically connected. Climate change is happening too rapidly for nature to adjust, thus exacerbating extinctions and ecosystem losses. On the flip side, biodiversity destruction amplifies climate change by releasing stored carbon and by weakening nature's carbon sequestering capacity. I was surprised by the difference in reception between the two modules. When climate change did not provoke denial or indifference, it elicited curiosity. Students were struck by the fact that humanity has become so impactful as to alter Earth's climate, and that the changes underway may prefigure scenarios like runaway heating or the plunging of Western Europe into Ice Age conditions. Learning about biodiversity destruction did not produce the same reaction. The response was not from the head, it was from the heart. The human sledgehammer on nature, the lives of wild animals, the shredding of the tree of life, these things evoked dismay, even taciturn silence, signaling that students found the material emotionally difficult to navigate. So the classroom was also a microcosm for witnessing the human response to nature's destruction. Indeed, the classroom was a space to see so much. For example, to see the ignorance surrounding the state of biodiversity, which, unlike the case of climate change, was not dispelled in the 22 years I taught at Virginia Tech. Something I found eye-opening, for instance, was that my undergraduates did not know that the European colonizers of North America drove the most abundant bird in existence, the passenger pigeon, to extinction. Apparently, that was not knowledge deemed worthy of American high school curricula. When I left Tech in 2020, my students had still not heard about the sixth extinction. If they'd heard something about it, they were under the impression that climate change is causing it. And as I mentioned, when students learned about the mass extinction underway, that knowledge hurt them. To see this hurt suggested to me that humanity is not indifferent to biodiversity collapse. To see that humans care, yet are kept in the dark about the free fall of biodiversity has always made me rage against the silence surrounding mass extinction. That silence remains obstinate. That silence sustains ignorance. If you doubt this, think about stopping someone shopping, say in a Walmart, and asking them, "Excuse me, I'm doing a survey. Do you know that a human-driven mass extinction event is happening?" I wager that 9 people out of 10 would stare at you with a blank look. What the silence and the ignorance portend is bad news. For the biosphere, it's ecological devastation, an irreversible loss of life forms, simplification of ecosystems, mass dying events, and a downgrading of a rich, species-diverse era in Earth's history by an unnecessary extinction of 50% or more of the planet's species. This will not leave a lifeless planet, but one filled with livestock, humans, agricultural fields, industrial landscapes, and generalist species that can accommodate us or parasitize on us. In other words, a planet colonized by industrial humanity for however short or long a time. Taking my cue from the classroom, the devastation of the non-human world will be mirrored in an inner devastation for much of humanity when people finally understand that a haven of life in the cosmos was turned into a human feedlot and commodity market. Climate change is not causing the 6th extinction, nor would the unfolding of mass extinction stop were the challenge of global warming solved tomorrow. A number of causes are driving the extinction crisis, including climate change, but the paramount physical factor is the food system, especially the industrial food system. And here I would like to share my slides, start sharing my slides for a while. The food system now occupies 50% of Earth's ice-free land, 3/4 of which go to animal agriculture. It's responsible for the destruction of grasslands, wetlands, rainforests, rivers, estuaries. The food system takes 70% of the fresh water humanity appropriates, thus underlying one of the deadliest sites of biodiversity loss. Over 80% of freshwater animal populations have disappeared since 1970. The food system is responsible for massive fertilizer and pesticide pollution. It is responsible for defaunation, from large carnivores and herbivores to huge losses of insects, birds, and amphibians. The food system has obliterated marine life abundances and countless habitats. It accounts for over 85% of the species at risk of extinction. The food system also accounts for roughly 30% of greenhouse emissions. What underlies the devastating footprint of food? Human expansionism, also known as growth or overshoot. Overshoot means that humanity is overtaking more and more of the natural world. Overshoot also means that humanity is overwhelming the world with waste that Earth cannot absorb or recycle. Overshoot is about the growth of all large-scale human system variables, the economy, including extraction, production, trade, and consumption, the human population, the livestock population, global build-out, and the spread of infrastructure. The variable underlying all of the above is the growth of the global middle class, meaning the billions of interconnected consumers. Climate change or no climate change, human expansionism is overtaking the face of the earth. The technosphere, meaning all man-made stuff, from shoes to satellites, including roads, buildings, malls, airports, seaports, and everything stocked 24/7 in the Walmarts and the Whole Foods of the world, the technosphere is devouring and replacing the biosphere. Here's one statistic that says it all. In 1900, the mass of the technosphere was 3% of Earth's biomass. In 2020, 120 years later, the technosphere surpassed the weight of all living beings. In the last 200 years, the growth of the technosphere has been accelerated by fossil fuel energy. But if fossil fuels become replaced with other energy sources without confronting growth trends, the technosphere will continue to spread and the industrial colonization of Earth will become entrenched. Human expansionism remains a topic of marginal concern in environmental thought, unregistered in political and policy circles, and often not problematized in leftist enclaves. Unsurprisingly, growth's inevitable consequence of mass extinction, of ecocide, remains hidden and unperceived for what it is: permanent biological degradation bequeathed to all posterity, and flagrant injustice toward the non-human world. Annihilating non-human natures and beings by mindlessly pursuing the growth of human systems promises dire existential and ethical consequences. Heeding those consequences means confronting the real issue that we face: humanity's scale of inhabitation and humanity's mode of inhabitation. This is the very issue not on the table. What we see instead is the framing of climate change as the problem. This narrow focus is the gist of the discourse of climate change. Before diving into this discourse, I want to add something more about overshoot. The science is complex, but the basic idea is simple. Humans have gone from being a subsystem of the biosphere to an industrial human enterprise that is overtaking the biosphere with the technosphere. That is the human scale part. The mode of inhabitation part is that humanity, for the most part, has become exterminating, managerial, and exploitative of non-human life forms and places. Humanity's scale and mode of inhabitation are two sides of the same coin: the domination of nature. The domination of nature is the seed of the root problem of overshoot. Here's what I mean by this. Overshoot and its sprawling technosphere are not simply physical events that have occurred as we've exploded in economic, demographic, and technological patterns. Rather, Earth's colonization has been actively pursued in the wake of a historically constructed human identity, which put itself above the creation, seized power of life and death over all nature, wild and domestic, and has assumed ownership of planet Earth. The supremacist identity of the human as exceptional and entitled made itself dominant in the long haul of history. It did so by wiping out enclave after enclave of indigenous humans, elaborating political, philosophical, and religious systems that have extolled human supremacist ideas. developing unrestrained technoscience and industry that have overwhelmed the planet, and taking on the mantle of planetary overlord, the god species. These interwoven socio-historical developments reveal that overshoot is not something that happened to humanity. Overshoot is an active doing of the supremacist human. Planetary colonization has been driven by a dominant narrative that philosopher Matthew Calarco calls human distinction. At the core of the imperiled plight of life lies this narrative, which has fueled expansionism, praised it, and conceived it as human destiny. Even at this 11th hour, the creed of human distinction keeps humanity incapable of questioning expansionism, let alone ending it and reversing it. So we hear little about humanity having stepped out of bounds, from earthling member to dominating Earth and impinging massively upon almost every planet variable. For the human distinction narrative, this is not the problem. What could be a problem is something that would thwart human expansionism, like climate change, for example. Indeed, climate change imperils the status quo, and the status quo is sluggishly waking up to the fact. This has enabled climate change to penetrate the mainstream in the form of the discourse of climate change. I turn to unpack this discourse, arguing that it obscures the broader predicament of overshoot and diverts attention from overshoot's underlying narrative of human distinction. I propose that the discourse of climate change is composed of the following. Climate change is the problem we face, trumping all others in magnitude and priority. Climate change results from fossil fuel combustion and is unrelated to humanity's scale of inhabitation and mode of inhabitation. Since climate change is the problem, we need a solution specific to it. Since it is caused by fossil energy, we need to shift energy sources via technological transitions. These three aspects comprise climate discourse in a nutshell. Climate change, framed as the problem, pushes the climate crisis front and center, whence it monopolizes attention, while other urgent matters become ignored or misrepresented. I've touched on how climate discourse marginalizes the extinction crisis. It does so in two ways. One, by sidelining it as less important. This is evident in how mainstream media regularly feature climate change reports while generally maintaining silence on mass extinction. And two, in environmental media especially, by misrepresenting the extinction crisis as a consequence of climate change. Of course, climate change has been aggravating biodiversity destruction, and the climate and extinction crises are on the verge of merging into a single devastating blow on all life. But to regard climate change as the cause of life's destruction is dangerously misleading. Let me elaborate with an example, namely, a tendency to diagnose climate change as the main driver of marine life destruction. Recent high-profile books about climate change make this error, briefly discussing the dire state of the global ocean and representing climate change as the culprit. But this is simply not true. Industrial fishing is by far the primary cause. The industrial fishing force behind the devastation of marine life abundance and habitats, especially since 1950, is worthy of public knowledge. To occlude this, even inadvertently, is wrong. Climate change has made marine life losses worse, and its deleterious impact will only get stronger. But the crucial point is the following. Global heating is impinging on marine ecologies that are already severely degraded by industrial fishing, and thus far less resilient and far more susceptible to the ravages of heating and acidification. Moreover, were climate change resolved tomorrow, the seas would still be at the mercy of industrial extractivism. This is an example of how the discourse, by shining the spotlight on the climate crisis, immerses other important matters into the shadows. The second feature of the discourse is that climate change is portrayed as consequence of fossil fuel combustion and unrelated to humanity's scale and mode of inhabitation. One way this manifests is in standard representations of climate change through smokestacks and tailpipes emitting carbon dioxide. On the other hand, mainstream society has yet to connect the dots between the food system and climate breakdown. Ignoring the fact that 1/3 of greenhouse gases comes from the food system encourages ignoring the comprehensive damage of the food system and the underlying factors. What are those factors? Most especially the global livestock population and the global middle class population continuing to grow together. Animal agriculture and the consumer class add significant dimensions to climate change routinely overlooked. Namely, that the climate is also breaking from the methane and nitrous oxide greenhouse emissions associated with food production, and especially with animal products. That climate change is beholden to deforestation for agriculture. 83% of tropical deforestation today is driven by agriculture. That deforestation constitutes a double climate whammy, releasing stored carbon and taking out carbon sinks. In 2023, for example, deforestation emissions were equivalent to the greenhouse emissions of India. And that the speedy growth of the global middle class is adding the element of acceleration. We do not simply face climate change. We face rapid climate change. The velocity of climate change is easily outpacing the international snail pace of phasing out greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change on steroids is playing Russian roulette with planetary physics that we do not fully understand, cannot predict, and will not be able to control. Rapid climate change is being driven by humanity's scale and mode of inhabitation. Scale is added by a growing middle-class population, expected today 4 billion people, expected to reach 5 billion people in this decade, which means more electrification, more build-out and infrastructure, more cars, more commodity production, more travel, more internet devices, more meat and dairy eating and eating out, all of which are growing the world's carbon footprint with reckless velocity. Mode of inhabitation is about wild nature's takeover and Earth's colonization, which perhaps no statistic better encapsulates than mammalian biomass today, having become 96% livestock plus humans. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a while. These large-scale trends, growing numbers of consumers and farmed animals, are not only accelerating the climate crisis, they are responsible for the extinction crisis and Earth's toxification. However, mass extinction and global pollution are largely ignored. As for the climate crisis, its mainstream solution has nothing to do with confronting these growth trends. Instead, climate change is represented as a technological problem. Before turning to the woes of climate technological solutionism, I want to briefly tackle a related matter connected with the prominence of the discourse in the public domain. The discourse of climate change has been boosted by two mainstream ideologies, anthropocentrism and technological fundamentalism. Anthropocentrism is the view that humans are the only beings to whom existential and moral consideration is due. Anthropocentrism bolsters climate discourse because climate change is visibly threatening, already pummeling humanity with heat waves, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, and more, while trailing an astronomical economic bill. On the other hand, the decimation of wild animals, 70% of their numbers gone since 1970, the extermination of marine life abundance, not even remembered, the destruction of entire biomes to graze and feed livestock, and an imminent mass extinction event are not conceived as threats to civilization. A colonized Earth, with the non-human world subjugated, is perceived in the mainstream as biophysically adequate for human existence. This line of anthropocentric thinking continually postpones scrutinizing the extinction crisis, while so many are galvanized by the directly perceivable threat of climate breakdown. But avoiding the topic of mass extinction as supposedly non-threatening to human existence not only wrongs non-human life by dismissing its inherent standing, it also wrongs humanity by failure to understand that human beings do not live by bread and circuses alone. To bequeath a mass extinction to posterity is to hand down sorrow and a profoundly disturbed sense of human identity. Beyond the injustice toward the non-human realm that ecocide is also a portal into humanity's dark night of the soul. Mass extinction is not something that people will just forget and move on to other things, like conquering more solar system real estate. Ecocide is a crime that will have consequences, many of which cannot be foreseen. What we can foresee is that ecocide will corrode human character and solidarity by entrenching nihilism on the one hand and by inflaming misanthropy on the other. I will not go into these big topics other than to say that nihilism is the belief that existence is meaningless and amoral, if not outright cutthroat. Misanthropy is deep-seated contempt for human nature. By fueling these dark standpoints of the meaningless and brutal nature of existence on one hand, and of human self-loathing on the other, human-caused mass extinction will halt the unfolding of humanity's highest potential. Nihilism and misanthropy will not necessarily be universal, but they will be pervasive enough to be universally inescapable. We have to feel into what we are handing the future by letting ecocide unfurl Instead of indulging in the platitude that as long as humans have fast food, Netflix, SSRIs, and artificial intelligence, they will be okay. We are made of the life force we are annihilating. We were born out of the nature cohort we are extinguishing. Ecocide guarantees to rebound in humanity's life in devastating ways. Despite grave consequences, mass extinction is overshadowed by fixation on climate change and its technological trappings, because people see climate change, but not mass extinction, as an existential threat. Yet it also needs to be said that framing climate change as the problem falls short even on anthropocentric grounds. Other menacing threats to humanity, like nuclear war and global toxification, are entirely overlooked. In today's geopolitical tinderbox of overshoot, aggravating conflicts over land, water, and other resources, the possibility of nuclear confrontation is real. Surely this threat is as concerning as climate change, yet receives little attention. Similarly, the mounting contamination of the biosphere, the thin envelope encompassing the planet, menaces human resilience, but this issue goes unnoticed. So I've been laying out the discontents of climate discourse, how it marginalizes and misrepresents the extinction crisis, how it's buttressed by anthropocentrism, and how it even sidelines other anthropocentric concerns. I turn to perhaps the most significant facet of the discourse, its intersection with technological fundamentalism, a term introduced by environmental author David Orr. Technological fundamentalism describes the social bias to glorify and submit to technology. Faith in technology is the ideological force behind nonstop technological developments poured constantly into the public sphere. In a world ruled by technological fundamentalism, it is unsurprising that climate discourse is steeped in technology. Three approaches ride climate discourse. One, replace fossil fuels with emission-free energy sources. Two, design technologies that grab carbon and sequester it. And three, geoengineer the entire Earth system to offset rapid warming. The representation of climate change as technological problem and faith in technology to solve it are taking humanity in the opposite direction that we need to go. In a time where the polycrisis of overshoot is calling us to cede human expansionism and degrow ourselves into a benign subset of Earth, mainstream approaches are scrambling for technological fixes while sustaining the domination of nature by the exceptional human. Instead of confronting overshoot, the fixation on technological solutions fuels it further, not only by messaging that growth is not the problem, but by orchestrating the growth of the technosphere in new directions. Before canvassing aspects of climate change technological solutionism, I make a relevant detour into critiquing technological fundamentalism, the unwarranted faith in technology that is so all-encompassing, it's got modern humanity living in its blind spot. Belief in the salvific promises of technology is coextensive with the exaltation of human power. For technology is regarded as quintessential expression of human uniqueness, aptitude, and resourcefulness. The display of and deference to technological feats of human power has a pedigree that reaches back to the monumental and engineering works of civilization's inception. Technology soared to new heights of idolization with modern technoscience and its forms of automated extraction, manufacturing, transportation, energy production, and the information and biotech revolutions. As social historian Lewis Mumford wrote, the inventors of nuclear bombs, space rockets, and computers are the pyramid builders of our own age. The aggrandizement of human power, favoring technological intervention across all domains of existence, crystallized with modernity. And I'm going to share my slide one more time here. Francis Bacon articulated it explicitly in his 1626 technological utopia, The New Atlantis. There, he proclaimed that molding the natural world through technology serves the enlargement of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible. So much was packed into this proclamation. Human pride, the exercise of tyranny over the creation, the abdication of ethics, the forfeiting of restraint, and the opening up of existence to experimentation. Another implication of enlarging the bounds of human empire concerns its timeline. Precisely none. There is no point at which this enlargement ends. Bacon's mission statement of modernity exalts a sense of human power that has no conception of limits, no moral misgivings, no sense of prudence or enough, and no sight for what it bulldozes into nothing. The endless mission to enlarge the bounds of human empire toward all things possible has become our fate and the fate of the earth. It is machine-mediated and invasive, favors technical and calculative reasoning, and intervenes via experimentation from atomic levels to planetary in both non-human and human worlds. Philosopher Hans Jonas argued that in the wake of modernity, technology became, in his words, a project and a restless phenomenon. Humanity is strapped into the roller coaster of what Jonas called technology's infinite forward thrust. We are so caught in the restless project of technology that we hardly notice its reign and quickening. Everything that streams out of it becomes normal, from endless new apps and constant updates to the relentless production of new models for personal devices, cell phones to automobiles, from filling the sky with satellites to gridding Earth with industrial infrastructure. Humans have been disciplined to sedentary indoors living in front of screens, while even thinking and creativity are to be outsourced to artificial intelligence. The techno fixes of precision agriculture and vertical farms are deemed superior to the arts of farming with Earth's inborn fertility. While the technological wonder world we inhabit appears as a manifestation of human power, both intrinsic human power and power over nature, its infinite forward thrust has made a laughingstock out of human power. The restless project of technology has power. Under its spell, humans have none. This loss of freedom to technology is both social and personal. There is virtually no social level capacity to choose not to pursue a technological project or to back out of it, while individuals tend to succumb to every technological rollout. Technological proclivity has become amputated from profound human capacities, like critical thinking, ethical sensibility, and countenancing virtues like temperance and foresight. Technological ingenuity has even been unseated from the qualities that gave it birth, imagination and reason. Who stops to wonder, climate change or no climate change, what Earth will look like in 20 years or 200? We exhibit incapacity to imagine what we are doing to the planet by overrunning it with the technosphere. Deference to technology also unseats reason. For example, in the making of nuclear weapons, let alone testing them on nature and at the expense of disempowered people, dropping them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and today considering outfitting them with AI. The capitulation to technology has flattened modern anthropos, corroding essential qualities like the capacity to reason, imagine, foresee, be heedful, respect limits, and put virtue first. To be sure, humans are mesmerized by technology because technological feats are often spectacular. More deeply, though, because of technology's ties to the narrative of human distinction. We are enthralled and beguiled by technology because we exalt human power. And therein lies the problem. The problem does not lie with human power itself, which, after all, is a gift of nature, whether it stems from our big brain, the opposable thumb, the invention of mathematics, the emergence of language, cumulative culture, really all of the above. Human power is a gift of nature. But the adulation of human power is aberrant and has unplugged us from the source of our being. Humanity has become incapable of bowing down to nature, honoring the entire creation, which, having bestowed upon us a magnificent home and extraordinary qualities, is clearly far, far greater than we are. Human engorgement with a sense of power, which technology most vividly mirrors back to us, has disconnected us from the fount of our power, nature. This critique of technological fundamentalism offers context for the technological solutionism of climate change, which falls right in line with a compulsion to unfurl more machinic inventions and interventions. But all the technological arsenal to the rescue cannot even solve climate change, let alone any other threat we face. Heaps of fossil fuels are required to make the wind turbines, solar panels, green infrastructures, etc. The climate juggernaut is far bigger and faster than what a renewable transition by itself can muster, especially under the socio-political regime of continued growth. Technological solutions will not preempt climate breakdown, but they do promise more nature destruction. For example, in the ramping up of deep sea mining for the materials of the so-called green economy. Decades ago, Herbert Marcuse wrote that crimes against nature are turned into a rational enterprise. In our day, crimes against nature are even turned into an ecological enterprise. Deep sea mining is a new chapter in enlarging the bounds of human empire, with mega machines to gouge seabed, seamounts, and hydrothermal vents that will drive extinctions and add more pollution to the global ocean. Mining the deep sea will inaugurate a new phase of the sixth extinction. Let's consider another technological approach to climate change, geoengineering. The most touted geoengineering scheme is spraying aerosols in the stratosphere to block sunlight and offer temporary bouts of cooling the planet's surface. The official depiction of geoengineering has been as Plan B, or as last-ditch option. That is, if Plan A of tapering off emissions failed and climate change went off the rails, we should be prepared to roll out Plan B, excuse me. An early public presentation was a 1997 Wall Street Journal article written by Edward Teller, known as father of the H-bomb. He titled his article, "The Planet Needs a Sunscreen." The moment Teller floated the idea of a sulfur pollution sunscreen to counter global warming, calling it Plan B, it may well have become Plan A. Why would we so speculate? Two reasons. One, the geoengineering option, percolating for decades under the radar, has arguably bankrolled political inaction around climate change. The last-ditch option likely helped dig the ditch, for geoengineering is exactly what the mainstream would consider an ace up the sleeve. And secondly, because geoengineering is irresistible, since the grandest technological venture possible is to experiment on the Earth system itself. Geoengineering is a summit, we might say, where the vectors of adulation of human power and technological unfreedom meet. So, would we be amiss to expect it? I'm turning now to the conclusion of this presentation by shifting from critique to a constructive offering toward surmounting the polycrisis. The way to safety and to historical renewal must have as most paramount component downscaling the modern human project. We need an approach that goes straight to the root problem of overshoot. I'm going to share my screen again. We have to lower the human population by instituting the human rights to achieve it. We must vastly reduce the livestock population by choosing mostly plant-based eating. We need to shrink the global economy by foregoing overproduction, reducing global trade, investing in recycle, reuse, reduce, conserving energy, renewing crafts, and living more locally. We must embrace slow life, including working less and getting off the technological treadmill. We have to fiercely combat pollution, beginning with abolishing persistent pollutants. We must phase out industrial agriculture and industrial fishing, the biggest offenders by far. Making food needs to be part of the biosphere, not the technosphere. And we must free and protect large swaths of terrestrial and marine ecologies and all life forms. Another way to articulate this degrow and restore approach is that we give back the reins to planet Earth to be in charge of biodiversity, climate, hydrology, and biogeochemical cycles of elements. Let forests expand and grow old, rivers be free, grasslands rebound, wild animals from butterflies to blue whales replenish Earth, animal migrations crisscross the planet, marine biodiversity flourish again. Unwind the technosphere, rebound the biosphere. Not only will mass extinction be averted, but a restored biosphere will keep nature's carbon stored and sequester anthropogenic carbon. At the same time, downscaling human systems will slow down emissions and enable meaningful technological transitions to occur at modest scales. Now, such a degrow and restore transition will demand investments in pensions and other social safety nets, universal basic income, conservation and rewilding initiatives, cleanup projects, disaster relief, and more. Where will those resources come from? Let's fire up our imagination on a par with our unprecedented historical plight. Alongside a global wealth tax that ecological economists have long called for, all military budgets can be slashed by 50% for starters, and the captured funds repurposed toward an ecological and just future. Would humanity ever choose to unwind the technosphere and rebound the biosphere? For that pathway to open before us, we must incinerate the seed of the root problem of overshoot. Humanity must consciously relinquish the domination of nature. In contrast, then, to Stuart Brand's famous appeal that we are as gods and just have to get good at it, let's recognize humanity's last hope for a beautiful life on planet Earth. Only by sacrificing the God species idea can the course of history turn. Thank you.